Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Anna McLaughlin. I'm the Program Director for Transportation Program Management here at AASHTO. I want to welcome everyone for joining us today, as well as all of our panelists for our TPM webinar today. I'm really excited about the conversations that we're going to have. AASHTO's Committee on Performance-Based Management is thrilled to bring you this webinar series in cooperation with FHWA and the Performance Management Technical Service Program. It's a great way to bring people together around a series of important topics. As always, a special thanks to FHWA, as their partnership is instrumental in making these webinars possible. Before we jump in, I also just want to put on folks' radar a great opportunity to connect, to collaborate, to just share with your colleagues and practitioners across the country. Mark your calendars for our 2026 CPBM annual meeting, which will be held in San Diego, California, October 6th through 8th. We expect to have an email coming out soon announcing that registration has opened. So I do hope that your calendars are marked and that I get to see you in person in San Diego this year. Today marks our 31st webinar in our bi-monthly series, featuring presentations exploring the importance of safety performance and the multidisciplinary approaches to integrating safety at state transportation agencies. For more information on this webinar series, please visit tpmportal.com. Navigate to events in the main menu and then select TPM webinar series. The TPM portal is also home to the series archive of recordings, downloadable slides, and other valuable resources related to transportation performance management. If you have any suggestions on future webinar topics, or if you have questions for the presenters during today's webinar, please put your comments or questions in the chat box here on Zoom. We're going to answer questions during the discussion at the end of the webinar after all of our panelists present. If you haven't already, please be sure to mute your audio so that we don't interrupt our presenters while they're speaking. They appreciate it, and so do I. Thank you. Right now, I'm going to pass things off to our good friend Lori Richter at Spy Pond Partners, who's going to get us started today. Lori, it's all you. Thanks.
Thanks, Anna. And now I would like to introduce our featured speakers who will be providing a framing of access as a discipline and the terminology to be familiar with as we navigate this discussion. We're joined by none other than the godparents of access, Deanna Belden with the Texas A&M Transportation Institute and Eric Lind with the University of Minnesota. Deanna is a senior research scientist in TTI's Community Coordination Program. She joined TTI in 2024 after 25 years at the Minnesota Department of Transportation, where she served as Director of Performance, Risk, and Investment Analysis for 13 years. Her career has focused on analysis, methods, and measures for decision support and evaluation. Since joining TTI, Deanna has worked with a team refining a new concept of access using observed travel data to describe the destinations that travelers and goods reach within a region and how a road segment may impact access. Eric directs the Accessibility Observatory at the University of Minnesota's Center for Transportation Studies. He leads research and application activities, including the National Accessibility Evaluation Pooled Fund Study, to measure nationwide access to destinations across modes. He holds a PhD from the University of Maryland and has over 20 years' experience examining complex systems through data visualization and statistics. Deanna and Eric, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Okay, today we're going to talk about measuring destination access to get everyone on the same page for our other featured presentations. Next slide, Eric. So we'll make sure to get everyone all on the same page by talking about measuring destination access. What is it and why we measure it? And we'll define it. And then we're going to talk about how it is measured, looking at system performance and a project evaluation. So destination access examines the ease with which travelers could reach valued destinations, such as jobs, schools, grocery stores, parks, or other services. Or as Jarrett Walker says, access is your ability to go places so you can do things. It describes a universe of potential travel, integrating transportation and land use. And I like to remind everyone that we're looking at this because the fundamental purpose of transportation is to connect people and goods to destinations that matter. So what is access? Let's break down the important components to understand it. Ease. Access reflects the cost of travel that could be time or money. What does it take to get there? And it's about potential travel. Could it happen? What's the full range of options people could reach, not just what they did in the past? And destinations. And access reflects the benefits of travel. Destinations are the purpose of travel. And what did you get in exchange for your time or money? So what is access? Part of the answer to this question is about how we should measure transportation performance. Access moves from network performance to people performance. Typical network or mobility performance looks at speed, delay, or volumes and measures whether people can move quickly. It includes only costs and reflects only transportation and is mode specific. But access asks if people can reach what they need. Slower is safer, and closer is better, and for sure, easiest is best. It includes costs and benefits, reflects transportation and land use, and is comparable across modes. Now we are already handed over to Eric.
Hi, had to find my unmute button. Thank you, Deanna. So Deanna has described the concept of access, and a lot of our work is to actually measure it, to put some data on those really convincing concepts. So I'm going to walk briefly through how we do that and what sort of output data then we make available for helping with the decision making. The basic idea of access measurement is trip planning. We take as many origins as we can handle and try to map trips to all of the possible destinations. Again, access is really about what's possible and the universe of options that people have. Uh, Access is about choices. We measure this using more than one mode because we want to make sure we cover all of the available choices that people might have. And we want to recognize that not all choices are universally available. So if you're under 16 or you're too old to see well or you have a broken right foot, you might not be able to take that automobile trip and you might have to look at other options. So choices are part of the access equation, and that's how it ends up being very multimodal. And as part of the calculation, we have to consider costs. These costs, as Deanna mentioned, is sometimes straightforward in terms of time. If you're a transit user making a particular trip from an origin to a destination, you are spending time, much more so than money. You have to travel a little bit slower to reach a transit stop. You have to potentially wait and meet the schedule of the vehicle. So that might be a big part of your costs as you're traveling. If you're biking, you might be thinking about costs as safety. What is the route that will take me maybe into the least conflict with other types of vehicles so I can feel safe and comfortable while I'm riding? Obviously, for driving, it's been a pretty big topic recently that the cost of driving is high and sometimes getting higher when it comes to fuel, but also just owning, maintenance, operation of a vehicle can be an expense that can limit your access. So that cost becomes an important part of the equation. And then if you're talking about a pedestrian mode, there's a lot of different aspects of moving around as a pedestrian to reach destinations that reflect the built environment around you, not just how far away things are, but are there things like street lamps if you're walking after dusk? So what we try to do is account for these different types of costs when we're doing these trip plans across modes. So when we do the actual calculations, we follow this process, which is again taken from Jarrett Walker, who has been a very good proponent of this idea in practice. when it comes to transit planning. But the idea is you have a set of destinations around you, and some of them are reachable in a certain travel time using the mode that you've chosen or that we would plan for this trip. So in this case, a walk plus transit trip in 45 minutes would end up reaching a subset of this universe of destinations. And what we do is plan that travel in all directions for 45 minutes and then ask, well, what is inside that boundary? What are they able to reach? Excuse me. And this makes it very clear for one origin, and the trick of the work of calculating accessibility data is that you do it for every single origin in a region, or in our case, across the country. When you do that and you pin back to that origin, to each origin, the number of things they could reach, you get a map that looks something like this. So this is putting that measured access onto the map. Each of these pixels is a starting place. And in our region of Minneapolis and St. Paul, if you're familiar with our transit system, you'll be able to pick out the places that are well served by high frequency transit. Those are the brighter yellow and orange places. And you can kind of see the shape of the transit system in general as you get farther away from those core downtowns. But putting the access in this framework lets us describe who has easy reach to this high number of jobs, right? We can also ask other questions like, how does this map compare to a map of job access by driving from the same origins, right? But this gives you a really good idea of where access is high or low. And that leads really well to the next question of, well, who is experiencing that access? And are we doing a good job in terms of providing the transportation access that we say we're trying to do? So in addition to mapping, we can also aggregate really well. And so we've been partnering with MnDOT for a long time and feeding their very comprehensive performance measure dashboards. For example, boiling down that regional transit map into a single number, which represents sort of the weighted average of access to jobs across the region. And you can see over time how that might change. And, in 2020, 2021, of course, we had the big COVID change with respect to travel to in-person work that has had a lot of implications on things. But one of the interesting things with transit is that the service, because of federal supplemental funding, was still running pretty robustly. So the access in terms of what you could reach was still very high. And it was only in those later years, 22 and 23, when some of the other constraints, funding constraints, and especially hiring operators kind of caught up with transit accessibility and service was lowered, and so the access was low as well. Anyway, so these are examples of how you can do this, thinking about it as a system performance metric aggregated up to a big scale. We calculate these data across the country. This is a map of driving average to census tracts. Mississippi and actually also Alaska did not participate in the last census data dump that we use for our job access data, so that's why they're sort of not there. But just to emphasize that, the access is sometimes thought of as an urban concept, but actually it does apply to rural areas as well. And just to give two more examples of how we use this data, these are actually auto access data. So maps of Columbus, Ohio on the left and Denver, Colorado on the right. And you can see the metropolitan planning areas are kind of outlined in the darker line. But what you can really see is how the highway network and the land use work together to provide access to people. So this is peak hour driving for 30 minutes. And in a place like Columbus, you can see that most of the region can really reach a lot of the jobs within that 30-minute travel time. In Denver, there's stronger differences as you get farther away from the urban core. Partially that reflects the fact that congestion limits what people can reach. And so one of the other things we do is look at travel times at the peak hour versus travel times in free flow conditions, and we can see the difference in access. So these maps are not showing where congestion is, but the darker regions are showing where congestion is impactful in terms of what people can reach. So that ring of dark brown around Columbus is essentially the origins where access is limited by congestion on a typical peak drive condition. So the last thing I'll show with our data is we've been able to look over time because we've been doing these access calculations and just showing how job access has evolved over that COVID spike where it went way up because no one was driving basically and there were no congestion limits. Most places are still more accessible than they were in 2019 and 2020, which is again I think a relic of an incomplete return to full congestion following these travel behavior changes. But the important thing for this discussion, I think, is this is just showing access as a metric. It's spatially comparable, it's comparable across modes, and it's comparable over time. These are all really nice properties to have in a measurement that you're trying to apply to system performance to understand whether it's matching up to what you expect. So with that, we'll zoom way back in from the global, and Deanna can talk more about project level access.
Yeah, so this is an example from Conveil, which is a tool or a software that allows users to change the underlying transportation network to reflect a proposed improvement and calculate the change in access. Eric just provided some examples from data produced by the University of Minnesota for the National Access Pooled Fund, but this is then another software, and this is not the only one. There are others. There's examples, Cube Access, formerly Sugar Access, and I understand you can do these kind of calculations from using transportation demand models, or you can build your own Conveil type system using the routing engine R5 and has open source available. But this is showing an example from Southern California. Rail expansion shows the geographic access using isochrones for with and without the expansion. So the blue area you see now, folks, in this particular slide is 45 minutes that they can get to more area, and it actually then also outputs the additional number of jobs that can be accessed. And then we'll just toggle through the next two slides that shows two more increases in travel time. And so, certainly the original area and then the blue area get larger. Okay, so I just had 3 to show that how it expands there. So that's this example from Conveil. Then the next slide. So there are new destinations available now compared to several years ago. We were looking just at access to jobs. And the new way we're looking at it is called dual access metrics, where it's how long does it take to reach a destination, like the first closest grocery store, or some of the other destinations that might be important, essential destinations to people could be education, healthcare, entertainment, parks, freight facilities. So in this example, we're suggesting from one origin, a person can walk 20 minutes to the nearest grocery store. And of course, that's going to be different, rural or urban, but this is just an example to explain this, looking at other destinations. And then for this, example, with 45 minutes to reach the third closest grocery store. So this kind of analysis will allow planners to identify areas where access to essential services might be lacking and consider transportation or land use solutions to improving. And of course, as transportation planners, we would be coordinating with the land use authorities to improve things. Next slide. And this is a map of the Twin Cities showing which areas can reach 3 grocery stores within 20 minutes by bike on level of traffic stress 2 network. And LTS to the biking stress. This is kind of a medium, not the easiest kind of routes, but just a little bit tougher. It goes up to LTS 4. So here it might be interesting to note, okay, these areas in green are not able to, so it might be areas of concern to look at where some improvements might be needed. An agency might feel that it's a goal that folks could reach the third nearest grocery store in 30 minutes. It might be different too in rural areas, but this is a way that this data can be used. Next slide. So these are some reading and resources. I don't have much to say about these other than these are great reports and books. And I actually took a couple off that people have been writing about access. That one of them was 2017. I mean, this has been a couple of decades now, at least that people have been talking about access, and a lot of still really good energy around it. But anyway, this will be in the packet or whatever you'll have, so you have these resources. And that's what we have. That's our introduction, and we'll now hand over to the other presenters.
We do
Thank
have
you.
one initial question from Kevin Zhang. Is there a good/comprehensive data source for peak hour travel times?
Hmm.
Well, I can attempt to answer it in the context of the work we do. So um, the way we generate those maps, those access values, is as I said, plan trips from all of the census block origins across a region. We buy data from one of the big data, network providers of segment level speeds by time of day, and it varies by, 15-minute increments or something like that, expected travel speeds. So we actually calculate the trips in those expected travel time conditions to generate a travel time matrix that then we turn into the access values. So I'm not sure if there's a better source. I kind of hope there's not, since we've been doing it that way and that seems to work for us.
All right, thank you. So I want to thank both of you for framing the theme of our webinar today and establishing the foundation of our upcoming presentations. I did want to go over the webinar learning objectives as well as the agenda for today. So for this webinar, the primary learning objectives are to explore methodologies of access measurement, analysis, and implementation, to identify applications for project evaluation, prioritization, and post-implementation performance, system performance, to highlight multimodal access analyses and how they can propel the integration of different modes into statewide performance discussions, and finally, of course, to share lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge. And now I'd like to review the agenda for today. So I will introduce each of our speakers before their respective presentations, but in brief, they are Henry McKay of Caltrans. He will be talking about access to destinations analysis for project prioritization. Thomas Craig from Washington State DOT, measuring access to statewide to enable a new performance measurement approach. And finally, Jonah Williams from Massachusetts DOT, talking about access to destinations dashboards, layering data to tell stories. One last reminder, I do want to remind folks to please make sure that your microphones are muted and continue to submit your questions through the Zoom chat. We will have a panel discussion after all of the presentations today. And now we will hear from our first presenter, Henry McKay. Henry is the acting data science branch chief at Caltrans, where he leads transit performance analysis, open loop payment implementation, and project prioritization efforts. Previously, in the Caltrans Sustainability Office, he established the department's accessibility analysis function, developed the Transportation Equity Index, EQI, and contributed to SB 743 implementation and roadway pricing analysis. Henry has a background in urban planning and statistics and enjoys applying econometric research methods to pressing public policy challenges. I'll turn it over to you, Henry.
Thanks, Lori. All right. Is everyone able to see my screen?
There you go. Perfect.
Great. Thanks. So great to be here. My name is Henry McKay, the acting data science branch chief at Caltrans. And today I'm going to talk about access kind of from the perspective of a large state DOT and how we've really implemented it into our practice over the past few years. So I'm going to mostly focus on project prioritization efforts and focus on kind of a few key in the weeds, I would say, aspects of that. But before I get into it, I will provide an overview of how we're looking at access in the state. So we have a few key Caltrans sort of applications of this, approach to analysis. The first thing we did was the development of the Caltrans Transportation Equity Index, or EQI. And this tool identifies low-income neighborhoods that have significant gaps in multimodal access to destinations, and also face significant traffic burdens. So really the idea here, though, is that baseline conditions assessment. So identifying where there's, based on current conditions, problems on the network. However, since then we've done a lot of work around project-specific prioritization, and so we released the Caltrans System Investment Strategy, or CSIS, back in 2024, which is the department's investment framework for discretionary funding decisions. It's very similar to or inspired by SmartScale in Virginia. So the CSIS includes three accessibility-derived metrics, looking at accessibility, disadvantaged community accessibility through an equity lens, and then passenger mode shift. And really, the intent of these metrics is to quantify exactly how much a given project is expected to move the needle on accessibility, ideally by increasing it. We also do other things with access that are more exploratory at this point. A big one is VMT modeling. In California, we have to look at induced travel as part of our environmental review process. Through SB 743. And so we think VMT is a pretty exciting, access is a pretty exciting tool that might enable us to, better predict VMT changes from projects. But with that in mind, I'm going to focus in a little bit more on project prioritization efforts and CSIS that I mentioned before. So again, the Caltrans System Investment Strategy, or CSIS, is our prioritization framework for discretionary projects. And CSIS is a framework, is more than just access to destinations. It's quite a few metrics, but it's really focused on climate, and it measures a given project's alignment to the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure, or CAPTI. So the CSIS includes three sort of key accessibility-derived metrics. Access to destinations, which measures, just how many new destinations can people reach. Disadvantaged community access to destinations, which measures the relative increase in destination access for low-income communities. And then passenger mode shift, which does use accessibility metrics. And so it measures to what degree non-auto access changes relative to auto access. So our project sort of increasing non-auto access without increasing auto access. And we look at a lot of highway projects that include non-auto components as well. And so this metric really is looking at kind of the balance of those benefits across modes. And then typically, when we do this analysis, we apply it to, funding cycles or individual funding programs to help make investment decisions. So before I get into some of the, technical specifics that I want to share, I will give an overview of basically our business process. Again, Caltrans is a very large organization and we live in a really big state. And so I kind of want to give a, look into what it looks like to run this analysis pretty regularly for lots of projects with a team. So basically just how we institutionalized it. So our business process is fairly simple. Typically for a given program, applicants will be aware that this is a metric, but they're not expected to calculate it like we do that for them. And so we give them forms that they submit to us. So like a Survey 123 form and some other spatial or GIS forms. And then project applicants submit basic project information to us that we need to score projects. And then a team of roughly 2 analysts and myself can code and run the projects in Conveil, which was the software that Deanna mentioned prior to this. And we do that roughly in 2-week sprints, where it's a pretty full-time effort where we're, going in and modifying the networks and doing the analysis. And then we do internal QA/QC, or I do that, and then, we make changes as needed. And then lastly, those Conveil runs are post-processed in batch using an automated workflow that we developed with Python and R scripts. And if anyone's interested in that, I can share the GitHub and the code. Lastly, we do have brief one-on-one meetings with the project applicants for every project. So I think a few months ago, I had like 45 meetings in the course of a few weeks, which was a lot. But we use these meetings to really explain how the metrics work and why the projects score the way they do. And in some cases, we miss things or, key information wasn't submitted. And this allows us to make really sort of final adjustments and settle on a final score. And then ultimately, we produce a thesis report card that we use for project prioritization purposes. And so you can see here on the right what that looks like. There's a lot more information there in terms of like comments and supporting data and stuff, but it's really just all those sort of high-level thesis metric scores. So that's our basic business process, and we've been doing this for a few years now. Next, I'd like to speak to a few key technical considerations. This is going to be pretty specific. I think the other presenters are providing a really good overview of access as a metric. And I want to focus in on a few key challenges that we faced, as a large state DOT operationalizing this concept and kind of how we responded to that in the metrics. And so, a few of the key constraints were, one, that the metrics had to really be applicable across the full state. And California is really big. And what that means is, there's challenges both from a metric design perspective in terms of we need metrics that work in downtown San Francisco and very rural areas simultaneously. So we really need to consider those differences because California geography is varied. And then it also presents some computational challenges just in that California is a really big state. And so we're doing lots of those origin destination calculations. Next, our analysis must be applicable to all modes. And so a given transportation project that we score typically is a combination of lots of sub projects. So it could be a highway widening that also includes some transit expansion and bike ped improvements. And so right there, that's 4 modes. And so our metrics really need to account for all those different modes and then ultimately combine them into a single score. And that turns out as somewhat challenging, at least conceptually. And then lastly, the metrics need to be responsive to different types of projects. And so we deal with a lot of projects that are interregional projects and are really oriented towards trips kind of across the state. But then we also see like neighborhood scale bike and ped projects. And those 2 examples are serving really, really different travel markets. And how you calibrate your metrics can mean one of those projects looks really good and one looks really bad. And so it requires some kind of thought in terms of how we do that, which I'll speak to. So the first sort of point here, deals with that issue of kind of place type and geography. And metric choice is really a key consideration here. And so there's lots of different accessibility metrics that you can choose from. We use pretty simple cumulative access measures where we weight the destinations by travel time. But even within that sort of construct, there's different ways of looking at it that lead to pretty different results. And so currently what we do is for access to destinations, we measure it as just the average number of destinations that become accessible for the average resident. And then for disadvantaged community access, we measure the same thing, but we measure it in percentage change terms. And so what this really does is measures different things. I have a graph here on the right that kind of illustrates this concept. Previous to the update we just did, both metrics were measured in percentage change terms, with the only difference being just a weighting factor of just kind of the whole population versus low income populations. And what you can see here with the orange dots is that, projects score received really similar scores across both metrics. And that really wasn't achieving what we wanted to achieve, which is that these metrics kind of look at different things. And so with the updated metric that we now use, that's shown in the blue dots. And you can see that the distribution is really different. And so there's some projects that score bad on both, some that score really good on both. But for the most part, they kind of look at different things. Typically, the percentage change in access metric really is going to credit those smaller projects that aren't increasing access a ton in raw terms, but it's a meaningful increase compared to the baseline. Whereas the average change in access is really going to be looking at those projects that are just kind of providing the most raw benefit. And we ultimately care about both those things when we're making decisions. So that's a pretty important consideration. Next is how we combine modes and destination types. I'm not really going to talk about destinations too much in this presentation. Um, I'll just say that we look at both jobs and non-work destinations, and we run analysis separately for each of those and then combine them and we weight it pretty equally. I will say, in most parts of the state, those analyses look very similar. Places with high job access typically have, high access to non-work destinations as well. But there are, especially in rural areas, places where the numbers can be pretty different. And so we think it's, important to include both. However, though, as I said before, projects often consist of multiple individual projects across modes. And so, combine how we look at those different modes is really critical. You know, we look at access for four primary modes. I'm not saying that's sort of the full, universe of modes, but we look at bike access, walk access, transit access, and auto access. Um, and we run analyses separate for all of those, and then we average them together into a final score. But the non-applicable modes, so if your project only, increases auto access, the three other modes will get zero. And the reason we do this is that when we add modes to a project, we want that to only basically serve to increase access. Whereas if we just averaged it, then you could have a really strong score for one, maybe transit access, but you add this other component that's, adding more access, but it's like lower, and then it would just decrease it if you did the average. And so um, projects that only include one mode oftentimes score lower in this framework, unless that one mode is just like scoring really, really high. And so it can kind of overcome the zeros in the average. Um, so, I think this method is imperfect, but it has served us pretty well and allows us to look across different project types and kind of look at things consistently. Um, Next, I'm going to talk about, this is probably the most in the weeds, like technical subject of this presentation, but is destination decay weighting. And this is really how we deal with this issue of projects serving kind of different travel markets and trip lengths and things like that. So just to introduce the concept, the simplest access, cumulative access metric would look at like how many jobs can you get to in 30 minutes? Just that's a number that you can count. Um, we basically do that, but we make it a little bit more complicated in that we look at the travel time to each of those destinations, and then we adjust the value of that destination based on how long it takes to reach. So that's basically to say a destination that takes 10 minutes to get to is going to be worth a lot more in our framework than one that takes, an hour. And we do this because it, adds a lot of nuance to the analysis. And then when we're doing project prioritization, we're getting credit for those, travel time improvements that affect destinations kind of on either end of that cutoff. So we're not just counting destinations, say if you're looking at 30 minutes that go from like 31 minutes to 29 minutes, but we're capturing the benefits across the whole travel time spectrum, which is really critical. So we use these decay curves that are shown on the graph. This is sort of the mathematical way of looking at travel time and decay weighting. So looking at basically the weight versus the travel time. And all we do is when we run the analysis for every project, we run all these different decay curves for each project. And then we ultimately score based on the curve that yields the highest score for that individual analysis. And what this does is it really, I would say, just kind of captures the project in its best light or looks at where it's sort of providing the maximal utility in terms of access. So you can see on the right here, this graph, this shows the variance in accessibility score between kind of the lowest scoring curve and the highest scoring curve. And, it's not huge. In some cases, it's a lot less than a point, but for some, it's pretty significant. It can be a, difference of up to like 2 or 3 points. And so, um, this is something we introduced recently, and it definitely makes the analysis process a little bit more difficult because you're just dealing with a lot more data. But it is a nice nuanced way to kind of deal with this issue of how we treat travel time. And it removes the arbitrary decision from the process, and it's a little bit more nuanced. So with that, I just want to touch on kind of some of the limitations around our current approach and some of the future research and kind of work we're doing to try to make it better. So I would say the first big like conceptual issue that we really haven't dealt with, and maybe we'll be able to deal with, we'll see, but it's really complex, is that transportation sort of land use paradox. And so we basically treat it as a static system at this point where we have destination data, which represents land use where people live from the census and then the networks. But we're not really looking at the transportation land use interaction. In some cases, if project sponsors have really good reason to believe and data to support it that land use is going to change significantly because of the project, like you're adding an infill, rail station in a place where there's going to be a lot of new development, we can model that, but it's still basically looking at it in a static way where, the best way to do this is really to kind of do those accessibility changes, model out how that might impact future land use, and then feed that back into the model. One of the resources that Deanna mentioned before. I think it's the book called Accessibility or Mobility Towards Accessibility or Mobility to Accessibility. Um, Basically proposes this method, and I think this would be sort of the gold standard method, at least in terms of methodological rigor. However, that does just have some practical limitations in terms of the availability of integrated transportation land use models, data, processing power, all these things. Things that we just don't really have right now and would make our project level analysis um, difficult to scale. So that's just to say that we think that's really important and something we want to be able to do eventually, but it's kind of on the back burner in terms of our current priorities. More near-term priority and something we're actually doing research around, and Thomas will probably speak to more in a bit because his state is really I would say the leaders on this are, data coverage for sidewalk networks. And so we use OpenStreetMap for our networks, and OpenStreetMap is imperfect. And so in a lot of cases, sidewalk data doesn't really exist. You'll just have a roadway center line with some tag of can you technically walk here or not? And that doesn't really tell us that much about the quality of the sidewalk if it even exists. And so we're working with the University of Washington to hopefully in the long term develop better comprehensive sidewalk network data that we can use for accessibility analysis. Probably won't change the methodology too much, but just having the data available will make the quality of the analysis much better. Again, Thomas has done a lot of work on this, so excited to hear from him. And then lastly, how we actually choose metrics matters a lot, as I mentioned. Currently, we're using cumulative access metrics. I think in future versions of this analysis, we might look at dual access metrics as well. Deanna gave a good presentation of that, or a good example of that. Likely for the equity analysis, and so we haven't really started analyzing that too much yet, but it's definitely on our radar as something we want to look into. And then lastly, how additional travel behavior considerations play into this. Again, we're looking at current access metrics as a very static thing, but there is a lot of exciting new research and methods that kind of take into account how accessibility kind of interacts with empirical and observed travel behavior. And that's definitely something we'd like to incorporate as well. So with that, I will pause. And if there's any quick questions, we could take them. But if not, pass it on to the next presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Henry. We do have time for an initial question that was in the chat for you from Andrew Tang at BART. And Andrew asked, is accessibility metric weighted by importance of destination? Coffee shop X versus convention center Y, for example. And he suggested maybe weight by total number of trips to the destination.
Yeah, that's a great question. So right now we do it in a really simplistic way, I would say, where we have destinations kind of defined as core destinations that are like hospitals, grocery stores, things like that, that are worth more. And then less core destinations, you could think of, I don't know, like restaurants, things that are important but not as important in everyday life. And those are basically weighted half of the core destinations. So very, very simplistic way of measuring it. In the future, I think we might want to try to do more nuanced approaches like Andrew suggested, like measuring by number of trips and things like that.
All right, very good. Thank you so much, Henry. Just a reminder, do continue to put your questions that you have for our speakers in the chat, and we will have a panel discussion at the end of our presentations. And next, we will hear from Thomas Craig. Thomas is a transportation planner at the Washington State Department of Transportation Public Transportation Division with 12 years of experience in public transit data and technology. At WashDOT, he focuses on the development of systems to make data-based planning easier for WashDOT and for its partners. Previously, as the manager of a technology vendor and consultancy, Thomas oversaw statewide and regional customer information projects for over 300 public transportation operators. I'll turn it over to you, Thomas.
Thanks so much, Lori. And everyone should be able to see my presentation now. Please stop me if not.
Yes, that looks great.
Awesome. Happy to be here today. I'm Thomas Craig. Looking forward to talking with you about a study that we are just now wrapping up and will be publishing actually later this month, measuring access across the state of Washington. Washington is behind in some ways in terms of using access measurements in our operational processes day to day. It was really great to hear from Henry, and also looking forward to the dashboards discussion. There are also aspects where while we're not yet operationalizing this day to day and project evaluation, we're looking forward to that as a possibility, thinking about how to build statewide consensus and understanding around destination access as a performance metric. And this study that we just are wrapping up this month is really a step towards trying to build that understanding and consensus within the state and set a baseline for that discussion to move it forward. So with that, I will begin talking about that project. I'm going to start by really introducing kind of how we are thinking about this conceptually or positioning it within the context of Washington state policy. And that is really by centering this discussion in thinking about our legislatively mandated state transportation policy goals. So on this slide here, you don't need to read through all this text, but this is actually a long quote from part of Washington state law that defines the transportation policy goals that WashDOT, the legislature, transportation decision-making bodies should be thinking about when we are making transportation decisions. Preservation, safety, stewardship, mobility, economic vitality, and environment, with a priority on preservation and safety. Those are in Washington state law, our transportation policy goals that we should be aiming our decisions towards. But we have a problem today in basically dealing with the insufficiency of our current metrics. We have a lot of good data. We have ways that we can think about the performance of different potential policies and projects, but that data really doesn't align with helping us ask some of the most fundamental questions that we presumably need to ask when we're thinking about future possible projects or policies, which is some sort of metric or system of metrics that allow us to ask, based on our goals, should we spend money on A or B? What direction do we want to head here in order to achieve our goals? That's really a type of metric that we don't really have access to within our framework today. So as Deanna mentioned earlier, we're thinking about access as really the point of transportation, something that allows access, allows people the capability to get places. We can talk about access as something that can be quantitative and can be measured somewhat objectively, and something that can be communicated pretty easily. We can all understand why someone who can get to 1,000 jobs in 30 minutes probably has more access to jobs than someone who can get to 10 jobs in 30 minutes. Likewise, someone who can get to a park in 10 minutes rather than 30 minutes probably has more access to parks. So thinking about access this way, we can actually link access to each of those statewide policy goals. We can think about an access metric as related to those exact goals that we just discussed, and possibly have access be a way to make decisions about projects and policies, looking at them both before making that decision and then measuring access after making that decision and implementing the project, as a way to be able to achieve our goals more effectively. So that's kind of the high level context within which we're approaching this statewide destination access measurement project. Why is Public Transportation Division in particular doing a statewide destination analysis? That's really coming from two specific legal requirements that we have here at WashDOT. The first is to develop the statewide public transportation plan, and apologies for the acronyms on this page, or on this slide. The statewide public transportation plan is legislated by Washington law, requiring it to articulate the state vision of an interest in public transportation and provide quantifiable objectives, including benefits indicators. That's something that we don't think we've done effectively in past iterations of the statewide public transportation plan, which we are in the process of updating and plan to publish a new version of early next year. And we think that measuring access to destinations through public transportation can do exactly that, can provide a set of quantifiable objectives and a benefits indicator, a measurement of how much public benefit is provided by the public transportation network. Additionally, in 2025, the legislature assigned resources to WashDOT to follow up on a frequent transit service study that we performed in 2023. That study had asked us to measure the number of people who live within a half-mile walk of frequent transit. We defined frequent transit. We came up with an answer to that question. As Henry hinted at, part of answering that question was really interrogating that word walk and thinking about what sorts of data we needed in order to answer that question fully and equitably. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. But that proviso assigned some resources that allowed us to really pursue this statewide measurement in depth, with a focus on walking profiles, on demand responsive transportation, and on demographic analysis as well. So through this approach, or through this project to measure access statewide in Washington, we set out with some specific intentions. One was to innovate with community. Access is a meaningful benefit for communities, and we wanted to make sure to develop our methodology along with community-based organizations in order to make sure that the system that we came up with was something that was reflective of the values of people who have a stake in our public transportation decision-making and may be benefited or harmed by the decisions that transportation decision makers make. So we're having conversations with community-based organizations as well as transportation policy partners that I'll talk more about in a moment, and using those conversations both to educate and teach about destination access analysis and methodologies, but also to learn what experiences are important, to learn how things land when we try to communicate them, et cetera. We're trying also to build capacity with transit agencies, MPOs, and other transportation decision-making bodies in the state. Access to destination is, of course, also a very valuable local planning tool, in addition to being potentially a valuable statewide performance metric. So we're collaborating with transit agencies and other bodies in order to help them use the model that we've developed, be able to leverage some of the tools and resources that we've worked on in order to perform this analysis. And really, we just want, through this project to test the value of measuring access at the statewide level. We think that this could be a valuable performance tool for many use cases, and we're collaborating with other divisions and inside WashDOT, as well as other state agencies to identify other application opportunities. So also in our technical advisory group that I'll talk more about here in just a minute, we had, for example, the Departments of Commerce and Health to think about the public health and land use implications of the model that we were building. And while Public Transportation Division led this project, we had half of our core team actually from the Multimodal Planning Division at WashDOT in order to start to develop an agency-wide consensus on how to move this type of work forward. So to perform a statewide analysis, we've been doing some work over the course of the last few years, really just to get different types of data sets available in order to be able to perform this type of analysis more systematically. Transit service data, that's the general transit feed, GTFS data from agencies around the state, including GTFS Flex data describing demand responsive services, roadway and sidewalk data. That Henry mentioned earlier, after that 2023 frequent transit service study, the legislature assigned University of Washington funding to develop a statewide sidewalk data measuring the presence of curb cuts, sidewalks, including the slope of those sidewalks across the entirety of the state where there are population centers. We also looked into thinking about what demographic and land use data and destination data would be available in order to measure access. And ultimately, the results of those data set collection activities is that we can now measure or calculate statewide access for all modes. I have an asterisk there because there are still some major gaps in particular around our access measurements for driving. We are not yet using speed data that was mentioned earlier in this discussion. We are assuming uncongested travel, just because that's not the mode that we are most focused on at this time. But in some sense, we can measure access for all modes and start to show what comparisons of those modes look like. So in order to develop our particular model that I'll go over here in just a moment, we had a technical advisory group that we walked through a series of conversations with. Starting back at the end of last summer, we had a conversation about sidewalks and walking to transit, then talked about the destinations that we would measure access to, how to approach a demographic analysis, finally, how to approach a demand responsive service analysis, just here a couple of months ago, before planning for a publication of our draft report later this month. I just submitted it to communications on Monday. We are going to continue this conversation, talk more about land use and other subjects over the summer before working this analysis into our updated statewide public transportation plan early next year. The technical advisory group has about 20 members. They are members of community-based organizations, as I mentioned. Those include, both community-based organizations that are focused on transportation, but also community-based organizations that are not focused on transportation, that are focused on public health or cultural services, et cetera. Transit agencies, MPOs, and other state agencies. So a pretty wide variety of partners in the technical advisory group that worked through with us through each of these technical subjects, read briefing papers, got a verbal briefing, and had a discussion and provided feedback that helped us kind of adjust our model as we went along. So what was the model that we developed? It comes in a few parts. First, when thinking about how to measure the ways that people would actually access public transportation, we decided with our TAG, our technical advisory group, to define a few different walking profiles. Ultimately, we defined 4 different walking profiles that basically set different parameters on the speed that people will use to access public transportation through the pedestrian network, the time that they will spend walking, and also the type of facilities that may be required. So for example, walking profile 1 which loosely simulates a rider with no disabilities. This walking profile will walk for 20 minutes at 3 miles per hour and is willing to walk on any road where walking is allowed. Our walking profile 2, loosely simulating a rider who may use a cane, walks for a less amount of time at a slower speed, requires sidewalks, and also a gradient below the Americans with Disabilities Act threshold of 8.33% slope. Our third walking profile walks at the speed of walking profile 1, but requires sidewalks, curb cuts, and also that lower gradient. So this is indicating or loosely aligned perhaps with a rider who uses a power wheelchair. Finally, a walking profile that is slowed down to the speed of walking profile 2, but is willing to walk on any road. And this was really came about through feedback from some of our rural representatives, noting that just the expectation of using a sidewalk on every trip is not reasonable in many cases and needed to be adjusted. I'm going to try to speed up here a little bit. After the walking profiles, we defined destination categories that we would measure access to. And we ended up with 6 destination categories: jobs, medical facilities, community support services, which includes banks, community centers, post offices, churches. The 4th category is food. The 5th is parks. The 6th is leisure, recreation, arts, and culture. Each of these is measured in a different way. One of the things that we started to determine with our technical advisory group was that different trips to different destinations look differently. And the way that a metric should measure access to different types of facilities might need to look differently. So for example, for jobs, we're measuring jobs with a decay function like the one that Henry mentioned, up to 60 minutes away. For parks, we're measuring a much shorter trip, only 20 minutes. For food, we're using a dual access methodology to measure the time it takes to get to 3 supermarkets, because maybe you live right next to a Whole Foods, but that doesn't fit into your budget and you need to travel to a lower cost supermarket. I'll go ahead on to the next aspect of our model, our demographic analysis approach. For this, we actually developed a kind of 3-pronged approach. One, to use American Community Survey data to calculate access for different demographic groups, but then also to use our walking profiles as a proxy to distinguish experiences based on disability and age. And a third approach to compare driver to non-driver access as an analysis to consider the differences that public transportation users face in comparison to people who have access to an automobile. Finally, we came up with a demand response analysis plan. I call this a plan because we didn't achieve this. We bit off a little bit more than we could chew within the time frame of our June publication deadline. We wanted to accomplish a statewide demand responsive service analysis. We didn't quite get there. We're pretty close. We're probably a month or 2 away. We did end up doing a case study on one county and did use some GTFS Flex data and the software application that we're using, Conveil, to measure access through demand responsive transportation. But we need more time to really pursue a statewide demand responsive destination access analysis. So we left that to a future step. Something that we didn't have a full discussion with our technical advisory group about, but that we did bring in at the last minute to use to help present our results, was a land use context classification schema that is currently in development at WashDOT. So basically, when we measured access, and you'll see this in some results that I'll share here in just a moment, we aggregated those results into different different categories of urban core, urban, suburban, and rural, based on the attributes of the census block that we were measuring access from. So we have a data set that identifies the category of these 4 categories for every census block in the state, and we aggregated results at those category levels. We did this because we needed some way to aggregate the results. There's 39 counties in Washington, so aggregating at the county level was going to provide way too many results to review, and also wasn't super useful because the counties themselves are very diverse. You have very, very different land use contexts within the different counties. So this was a way to provide both more readable results, but also provide results that had more clear significance. The report itself that will be published here later this month is laid out with an executive summary, an introduction that provides some context and guidance for the reader, background on the methodology that I've just gone through, then a section that just has the tables of results, followed by an assessment that really gives a narrative reading of those tables, an interpretation of what we found, a conclusion with some big themes and next steps, and that's where we really kind of lay out a work plan for where to go forward, and of course, information on the data sources and software that we used. Okay, so let's look at results for a minute. We're not going to look at these results in depth. You will be receiving these slides later, and if you'd like the report later this month. So there are plenty of tables to look at, but this is an example. This is the statewide kind of like, this is, for example, the one table that is in our executive summary. This is the overview results table for the entire state, where we showed calculated statewide population-weighted averages for each of our destination metrics: jobs, medical, food, community support, parks and leisure, along with each of the different modes that we identified. So in green are non-transit modes, and in the blue shades are transit modes. We have, walking profile 1 with transit, for example, has access to 68,000 jobs on average statewide. Walking profile 1 without transit, so just someone walking alone, only has access to 4,400 jobs. So you can see that there is an increase in access by virtue of having the public transportation network of about 15 times for walking profile 1. So you can see the difference between results for just walking, results for corresponding walking profiles. You can compare the different walking profiles, and you can compare all of that to access for drivers as well. There's some high-level themes that you can see here when we just look at the differences between the different columns. In particular, transit adds access. At the same time, the access that transit adds depends on the degree to which you are able to walk in order to access destinations and access the transit itself. Access for walking profile 1 is significantly higher than access for walking profile 2, for example. We'll talk more about that in results in just a second. I'm going to continue to try to speed through this. For each individual destination metric, the 6 metrics that I mentioned earlier, we presented 2 tables. One had rows indicating the statewide statistics for each of those land use types. So here is the medical results table by land use. We have the statewide results on top. Then we have the results for just blocks in the urban core, just blocks in urban areas, just blocks in suburban areas, and just blocks in rural areas. Here you can see some basic trends. Once again, average access tends to be higher for the urban core than for rural areas. Each cell has both the calculated access value and then also a percent value in parentheses. Those percent values in parentheses are the percent of people who had no access by that metric. We found that that was an important context in order to really interpret some of these results. So, for example, walking profile 4 in suburban areas, on the medical metric, they scored 0.18. But some context there is that 67% of people living in suburban census blocks had a 0.00 medical score when they were using walking profile 4. So that kind of provides some context to understand what percent of people have some amount of access. The second table that we presented for each metric, instead of being separated by land use type, is separated by demographic categories. So using American Community Survey data, we laid out the general population statistics as well as 5 different demographics. Here, I'll talk about this more in just a second, but notable basically is that the differences between the rows is not super significant most of the time. The differences between the rows, i.e. the differences between demographic groups, is much less than the difference between walking profiles or the difference between transit and driving. So in that narrative, that assessment, we provided some insights about access and then kind of described the data to explain why we came to these conclusions. And some of the general insights about access that we came to were that public transportation provides critical access in all areas of the state. From rural areas to the urban core, public transportation provides access. That was very significant. At the same time, there's more access to destination in more urbanized areas. That was also a clear trend from the results. Gaps in the pedestrian network are significant barriers, especially in less urban areas. So as you moved out of the urban areas, the gaps in the pedestrian network were more significant for differences in access. Long distances walking to and from transit are often very extreme barriers, but at the same time, transit adds more value for shorter distance walkers. So this was kind of a two-part finding. On the one hand, we noted that walking profile 2 had even reduced access versus walking profile 3. In other words, being able to walk only a short distance was more of a barrier to access than needing a curb cut, simply put. But at the same time, the multiplier of access that you got from having transit, if you walk only a short distance, was much greater. Finally, time of day is a greater barrier for public transportation in less urban areas. With regard to demographic disparities, we think we had inconclusive results from using demographic data. We don't think that separating and calculating access by demographic group was a terribly insightful exercise. There's some follow-up research to do there, but we didn't find clear disparities based on demographic group. However, the other 2 methodologies we used did find very significant disparities. Comparing access based on the walking profiles indicated very strongly that there are major disparities based on mobility disability, regardless of where you live in Washington. If you have a shorter walking speed or require curb cuts, you face significantly less access on account of that. And comparing driving to non-driving, we found that that indicated very strongly a disparity between drivers and non-drivers. Anyone who loses access to their automobile immediately faces a huge downgrade in their access around the state. So finally, looking forward, we get at this in our conclusion. We think that destination access could be used in forward-looking evaluations of Washington's transportation choices. We're looking at this to both evaluate potential grants and also to compare different potential projects and policies within WashDOT. We think that this study demonstrated that destination access can provide a useful tool to inform decision-making in alignment with our statewide transportation policy goals. And the conclusion lays out a specific set of actions, a work plan essentially for the 2027 to 2031 timeframe in order to move that work forward. probably gone well over my time, but hopefully that gives a good overview of our research, and we'll have our report coming here in just a couple of weeks.
Thank you, Thomas. And if when you do have that report, if you have a link to that publication, if you could send it to us, we'll be happy to add it to our resources on the TPM portal as well. All right, and finally, we will hear from Jonah Williams. Jonah is a transportation program planner on the Environmental, Social, and Governance, or ESG, team in MassDOT's Office of Transportation Planning. Jonah's work at MassDOT focuses on developing resources and conducting data analysis related to destination access, transportation vulnerability and security, and land use and housing. Jonah, it's all yours.
Hey, thank you. Let me just share my screen here. Okay. So yeah, today I'll be presenting about 3 different dashboards that we've developed at MassDOT. And all 3 of these dashboards have a component related to access to destinations. And they also visualize patterns in land use and transportation infrastructure throughout the state. Obviously, as we all know, there's a wide variety of data sources available. So these dashboards help make those data sources more visible and help disseminate them to throughout MassDOT and partner agencies that we work with at MassDOT. So the first dashboard I'll be talking about is the Accessibility Observatory dashboard. Here you can see the 3 dashboards: the Accessibility Observatory dashboard, Community Transportation Explorer, and the Service Coverage Planning tool. So Eric talked about the Accessibility Observatory, obviously, since Eric is from the Accessibility Observatory. And so we have been a partner with that pooled fund study for a number of years. So we have data from the pooled fund study going back several years. And we share this data with a variety of stakeholders at MassDOT, as well as partner agencies like MPOs that we work with. But in order to make that data more visible and be able to share it more widely, we've developed this dashboard. So the dashboard visualizes job access by mode of transportation and travel time threshold. And the intended audience and intended use is to help understand existing conditions of an area and visualize the distribution of destination access across the state. And it can also be used to compare access between different modes of transportation. So like I mentioned, the data comes from Accessibility Observatory at University of Minnesota, using jobs data from loads and GTFS fees for transit service and OpenStreetMap and travel time data. So yeah, I'll get into a bit of what the dashboard looks like and talk about when I'm in the demonstration, some questions I can answer. So for all the dashboards, rather than doing a live demo, I have a brief video we've recorded, and the dashboards themselves are linked in the slides that we can share afterwards. So here you have the map that the dashboard opens to. So the way to interpret this map is from each location on the map, how many jobs can you get to? And the kind of darker red colors are where you can get to the most jobs in the given travel time by the mode you selected. So the map right here is showing in 2024, how many jobs can you drive to in 30 minutes? And you can interact with the filters in the top left, and the map and the legend will update. So I'm going to go ahead and play the video that we have and talk about how to use the dashboard. So here you can see there's all the filters. You can filter by year, mode of transportation, and travel time threshold. We have between 15 minutes and 60 minutes. You can also filter by MPO region. So here I've selected the Pioneer Valley region out in Western Mass, and the map zooms in, filters to that region, and you can click on an individual census tract. In this case, we've visualized based on census tracts. And if you click on the tract, it will show you in the pop-ups the number of jobs accessible, in the time threshold, and by the mode you selected. And what I did there previously was update the map from auto to transit. And so now what the map is showing is 30 minutes by transit in 2024, how many jobs can you get to? And we looked at comparing jobs by auto to jobs accessible by transit in Springfield, Massachusetts. So you can compare access by the different modes. So that's a very quick overview of our dashboard with the accessibility observatory data. But as I said, the dashboard is also linked in the slides that we can share later. And the next tool is the Community Transportation Explorer. So this brings together a variety of data sources. It focuses on land use and demographic data. So the dashboard can be used to visualize the distribution of communities and existing conditions throughout the state, and can support project development and project prioritization by identifying locations of communities based on certain land use characteristics or demographic characteristics. So the land use data, which we're going to focus on a little bit more in this presentation, it assigns scores to, in this case, census block groups based on a variety of categories. So there are access, affordability, environment, infrastructure, and safety. And each of those categories have scores from 0 to 1. And then there's a cumulative score that is the total of all those categories together. And so the way the tool works is you can move sliders to select different ranges of scores, and the map will update to show those the geographies meeting all those criteria on the map. So in the example here, you can see there's places in Massachusetts that have higher access scores and higher safety scores that also have a higher concentration of people with with limited English proficiency. So the access score specifically is based on an index, is an index based on access to jobs and critical destinations, including food retailers, medical centers, schools, and public housing. And we calculate the access metrics using Conveil, which a couple of people have mentioned previously in this presentation. And yeah, we look at access by all modes within a 45-minute trip. And yeah, so with that, I can get into a bit of the demo. The same thing, we have a video showing the tool. All right. So the first page focuses on the land use score. So you can move any of these sliders. So here we're looking at higher access scores of places with greater access to jobs and critical destinations, and lower infrastructure scores. There might be places with less presence of bike and pedestrian infrastructure in the state. And it's filtered to places where those two things are true. And this is based on demographics data from a data set we've produced called Regional Environmental Justice Plus. Let's see. There we go. And with all these pages, you can also filter by different MPO regions. So here we're looking at Cape Cod, places with limited English proficiency and zero vehicle households. And these demographic categories are flags assigned based on thresholds relative to the region of the state. So Massachusetts, like a lot of places, has a variety of land uses and demographics and context throughout the state. So that's why we've assigned those categories relative to the region. So here you can see places that meet all those criteria in Cape Cod. And the final page is land use and demographics, where you can filter by both of those categories together, the land use score and the demographic categories. So we're looking at higher access scores, lower infrastructure scores, and lower safety scores. So that might be, for example, where there are places that have greater access to destinations, but they might not have much bike and pedestrian infrastructure and have high rates of crashes and high risk roadways. So thinking about places where safety improvements and infrastructure improvements might be important. And then also you can look at how those locations overlap with places where there's a higher share of senior population, so residents over 65. And here we've looked at this location, and you can see all the different the data behind those scores and categories if you click on the pop-ups. So that's a bit about the Community Transportation Explorer, and yeah, happy to answer any questions at the end as well. And the final dashboard we're going to talk about is the service coverage planning tool. So this came out of a need for the regional transit authorities. So there are 15 regional transit authorities in Massachusetts. There was a requirement for them to assess coverage to key destinations in their service areas. So MassDOT previously created a tool to help with that process. And around the same time, there was also a similar tool developed by a regional planning agency in collaboration with the Food Bank of Western Mass. So we have now since combined those two tools and developed this updated version of the service coverage planning tool. So this tool displays transit routes and stops, along with critical destinations and travel demand flows. And the tool can be used to identify which destinations are served by transit and what transit routes operate what time of day and on what day of the week. So the intended audience for the tool is people planning transit services, or identifying gaps in service, and people who are advocating for expanded transit service. So with that, we can get into the video. So the map opens all of the regional transit authority service areas. So here we're looking at the Berkshire Regional Transit Authority. And here we have a variety of destination types. So we've selected all these destinations for their importance for education, access to food, and public health and civic destinations. So here we selected all food retailers in the Berkshire region, and the map lights up on the map with where those destinations are located. And then another thing we can do is looking at if the destinations are within a quarter-mile transit or outside of a quarter-mile transit. So here we looked at food retailers that are outside of a quarter-mile transit. So if Berkshire RTA was looking to expand their service, they could identify locations that might be important destinations that are not currently served by transit. And yeah, all of the destinations also have pop-ups where you can see more information about them. The next tab for transit routes, you can filter by day of the week. So here you can see there's no Sunday service in the Berkshire region, but most of the routes operate on Saturdays. And then we can also look at the routes based on the work shift they have service for, first shift, second shift, and third shift. So here we're looking at routes that have service for the first shift. So could people who work a typical like 9 to 5 or 8 to 4 schedule, get to work and picked up from work by these bus routes. And with both of these filters, the goal is to see, is there service to the destinations when I need to get to them? And the final tab is the trips tab. This is looking at trip flows, and this is using a data source. We have access to a MassOut replica that looks at travel demand. So here you can filter by any town and trips starting in any town, going to any town. So we're looking at trips starting and ending in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. And that then displays the patterns of the trips in starting from any transportation analysis zone TAZ to any other TAZ. So kind of the takeaway from this is, while it's a small geographical area, there's a lot of trips going east to west in Great Barrington, and bus service in the Berkshires typically goes, or for the most part, goes north to south. So it could help identify, are there patterns in travel by modes other than transit, or by all modes that transit isn't currently meeting. So that's a bit about those 3 tools we've developed, and I'm happy to answer any questions we have in the panel discussion.
All right, thank you, Jonah. We will now hear from all of our presenters in a panel style discussion, which will be moderated by Deanna Belden. So we'll have all of our speakers turn their videos on, and I will turn it over to Deanna at this point.
Thank you so much, Lori. We have a couple questions that came in the chat. So we're going to start, well, we'll definitely start with the first one of those. And good, Eric Lind is there too. But so for all the panelists, do you have recommendations for how to calculate access via true multimodal routes? For example, walk to bus, walk to driving to a parking lot. Seems relevant for transit access, but would it involve stitching together a pedestrian network and a transit network? I know Eric is prepared for this one, so we'll give it to Eric first.
Yeah, I think it's a great question that when we're doing this kind of trip planning to feed into access, as Thomas was describing, there's a lot of details that you have to think about for, how this trip actually happens. And when we think about driving, it tends to be like, well, the car is right there, and then you get out where you're going, and that's kind of it. For transit, you have to think about how do you access the stop, get to the stop from your origin location. That can be walking, that can be biking, that can be driving. There are park and ride access models. There are combination bike to bus to bike, access models. So you can put those details in when you're doing the access calculations. You just have to be upfront and it adds a layer to manage which kind of trip that you're talking about as you do this. I'll just put in one other note, and I'm sure others have comments, but one of the things we've been doing lately is playing around with e-bike plus transit access. And that really has the possibility of opening some cool, levels of accessibility, given that those modes can combine, whether you're talking about a train, you can bring the e-bike on, or more and more systems are allowing you to put an e-bike on a bus as well.
Yeah,
anyone else? Yeah, go ahead, Thomas.
I'll add here briefly, and thanks for mentioning that point on e-mobility, Eric. I think that is really important and something that one of our advocates encouraged us to put in the conclusion of our report. I think you covered it well, and I'll say just also that with current technology, it's pretty easy to measure transit as a mode with different assumptions about ingress and egress on either side of that transit trip. What becomes really difficult is measuring trip chaining, where you have like different trips stuck together that may involve different modal assumptions in between. Maybe you take a scooter in the middle of a trip that otherwise is transit focused. So that's kind of difficult. And then also combining, like, transit is sort of easier to combine with other modes in a certain sense, fixed route transit, because it has designated access points. It has these stops where you walk to a stop, and then that is the fastest way across the network. But when you start mixing other types of modes, where's the best transfer point between a bike and a demand responsive vehicle? Well, there's another difficult math question that you have to figure out the answer to because you don't have a designated transfer point like you do for fixed route transit. So those combinations of different modal types becomes more difficult, but transit access and egress is a solved problem.
That's helpful and interesting. Anyone else? Okay, now I'm going to go to this topic of prioritization and practical application. So this first question is for Henry. Your work focuses on integrating access metrics into project prioritization. What's the most significant pushback you've received from decision makers, and how do you use the metrics to overcome it?
That's a good question. We deal with this a lot. I would say, it's probably just in California, at least in the programs we deal with, before sort of we started actually quantifying access, it was long discussed as like a qualitative thing. Um, and so we had a lot of project proponents and applicants used to kind of like describing their projects, the access benefits qualitatively. And so that's been tricky. We've gotten a lot of pushback of just like, your metric doesn't work. Like, my project is kind of basically special for these reasons. It's not quantifiable. This is a bad approach to project prioritization. Um, and some of those things are basic, like just misunderstandings of the metric that we can be transparent about. Um, but I think honestly, maybe it's a bigger question than just access, but it's like sort of the psychology of dealing. Like, I've never really worked in a situation where I'm advocating for a given project. I've always done kind of higher level project prioritization, kind of strategic planning, things like that, or evaluation. And so trying to like convey your access metrics in the framework to folks that are kind of on the other side of that, that don't really necessarily care about the portfolio of projects, but care about their individual project. Um, that's really tough. But I think doing as much engagement sort of at the beginning on what the expectations are and like setting that pathway of, oh, you can be successful here. You just need to give us the right data, and like when you're developing your project, know how to think about it. Um, that's kind of how we've tried to push back on it, because we've had a lot of awkward conversations around just like, a project doesn't really do that much for access, but the project sponsors kind of think it does. And there's just kind of a gap there between the theoretical and the like quantitative. Yeah, Deanna, you're muted.
Wanted to keep quiet when I wasn't talking. Okay, do you think you had have different projects in California been prioritized based on incorporating the access? I mean, do you feel like they are spitting out different list ranking?
Um, Theoretically, yes, but again, access is only like one metric of several, and they're equally weighted. Um, I would say like we get a lot of projects that we evaluate that are essentially like on the transit side. It would be like state of good repair projects, or bridge replacement projects, things like that, they're essentially like maintenance projects that are coming to these discretionary funding sources meant for more kind of, I don't know, I would say like mobility focused projects, just because of a lack of funding in other places in certain cases. So I would say projects like that maybe tend to, it's a little bit trickier, where previously there was more of those like qualitative arguments. And with access, it's like pretty clear of, oh, this doesn't really provide new access. Um, but that kind of raises more of a question about just funding programs and guidelines and things like that than the individual metrics. But generally, it promotes good projects that provide a lot of access, and ideally ones that do it with, less resources and are creative with it.
Great. Okay, I'm not gonna go on mute anymore. So this question came in from Kevin again now about project prioritization. When combining multiple dimensions of scoring, access, safety, et cetera, is the main way your framework is it to create an aggregate score or a simple average? And he says, are there regret-based approaches like min-max you use?
Yeah,
And then,
so we two parts of that. So it is a simple average, and the need again for that is just so that we can have one number that's like project X scores higher than project Y, acknowledging that both projects have a bunch of like subcomponents. Um, and then we do have a min and max, and so like the distribution of like accessibility scores for a program of projects is not normal. Like there's typically a cluster of like lower access ones and then some like really, really high ones. And so we set like a sort of thresholds there. So for example, I think for the percentage for disadvantaged community access, it's like anything over 1%, you just get a score of 10. And we have similar thresholds for the other metrics. So we basically cap it. And then we actually do cap it too on 0. It used to be like we had this whole part of the framework built in for projects that decreased access. And then we found that there just really weren't that many. We haven't really seen it yet. Most projects applying to our programs at this point just increase access to some degree or just don't really do anything.
Mhm.
So it's kind of capped between 0 and like 10, but we have those thresholds correspond to like actual access numbers.
Anyone else on the panel want to talk about that one? Okay, I'm going to move to the topic of communication and dashboards. So for Jonah first, your team uses interactive dashboards to make destination access tangible. What is the biggest challenge in translating complex access metrics to a visual tool that is useful and understandable? And how do you move beyond just showing the data to using it?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I think obviously there's the challenge of just including too many things in one tool, that it becomes difficult for the general public to understand, as well as like having the information in an accessible way of explaining how to use it. So I think part of that is just like getting the resources out there as much as possible and presenting them in a lot of forums and talking with people and meeting with people to talk about them. Um, and I think oftentimes the dashboards, it might not necessarily always be like the final data product that people use, but it's a way that people can see it and get some ideas of how to use the data. So, for example, the Accessibility Observatory dashboard, we've created that and shared it with a lot of different people. But then there are cases where, for example, like MPOs we work with will reach out to get access to the data because they want to develop their own maps and use it in different documents they're creating. So I think that, and then also a couple of other things, the REJ Plus data that is in that Community Transportation Explorer, the demographics data, people use that for a wide variety of resources. So I think, yeah, the dashboards can be kind of like the introduction to the data, and then people can use them in however they see fit, developing their own maps and using it in their own projects.
Great. So for the panel, what have been the most successful examples of measures or dashboards actually influencing a transportation project scope or funding? Okay, maybe that one's too hard.
That's a great question. It's where we want to be. I was just going to jump in and say that
Mhm.
so I'm not in an agency because I'm at a university. I used to work at Metro Transit, which is the major provider in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And what I can say is that access evaluation did show up in transit planning in really real ways and in some pretty major ways about how they thought about allocation of new service, new high frequency bus service, whatever it might be. The benefit of doing that access approach where you can compare scenarios and look at those bubbles you were showing, Deanna, of where and for whom things are going to change is super powerful. And I think transit is ahead of many, and maybe Thomas's project is showing that as well at the DOT level, that maybe that's where it does make a lot of sense because of that sort of um, the the scenarios are maybe clearer. But I think the same principle could definitely apply to any DOT project, which is like, you're always dealing with a basket of projects you may
Mhm.
fund and build, and some of them will impact people differently. So I'm not sure if anybody has a great story about it, but I think that the data are there and the methods are there to make this happen. So
Yeah, it's definitely still a future that we are, trying to work towards and build consensus to, allow this to really affect decision making in the way that it could. Um, this isn't exactly an answer to the question, but kind of I would point to two things. Um, uh, where this is making a difference is in local transit planning by especially transit agencies who are thinking about these metrics in the context of um, service changes, system network design. A few people, mentioned in different presentations, Jarrett Walker's work, and that, for example, using R5 and doing destination access analyses is, I believe, part of a process of many of the network design projects that they and other firms work on. So this is changing networks in transit agencies around the country and around the world, though not necessarily through public dashboards. I will say one thing that I have personally witnessed people really have aha moments about in looking at visualizations of access is in early on and building kind of a consensus about the need to pursue this project that we're currently finishing up. We often showed a visual of Yakima, Washington, and the current travel shed from one area of Yakima, and what the travel shed would look like by public transportation if frequency were doubled, if the service went from being a 30-minute service to being a 15-minute service, and the way that that really greatly increased the access and the number of jobs that a person had available without any change in the speed of the bus. The bus is moving the exact same speed, but by virtue of transfers being half as long, suddenly you have much faster travel to destinations. And that was something that I witnessed in a number of conversations where people were like, "Oh, you don't need to speed up the bus in order to get access to twice as many jobs." And they, their entire like worldview of what improvements to a transit network, meant changed in that one image.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. We have a question coming in. How do you calculate an access score for a state of good repair project, such as a bus replacement or shop improvement? And Lindsay Dowell comments that at Michigan DOT, they've used access analysis as part of prioritizing bridges for investment. But I'm wondering, for buses, it wouldn't necessarily be that that particular bus is on like the most important route, or so. Can we do that for bus replacement or shop improvement? Would we include that access?
I think like one way we've looked at those type of projects is sort of the counterfactual of like what would happen if this didn't exist. It's basically the same analysis of just the baseline scenario is, that reduced transit frequency or service because you don't have enough buses or a bridge not existing or whatnot. The difficulty then is like how you apply that standard fairly across those type of projects versus projects that are providing new access or new benefit from the current baseline, and kind of where you draw that line of, imminent like service decreases or bridge failure. So we try to be flexible and like look at it that way when we can in our analyses, but more of a conceptual difficulty, I think, than a technical one.
Transportation is always about money in and access out. It's more complex than that. There's a lot of other factors that like kind of obscures, but you're putting money into a system in order to build roads, put buses on the road, lay track, whatever you're doing, and you're getting access out of that. And I think that counterfactual example makes a lot of sense. And one of the difficult things about transportation decision making that access, if we really think about it, can help us solve is that humans are very bad at understanding depreciation. Um, like it's easy for us to understand that you need to pay the driver to have the bus on the road, but we forget that you need to repair the road after some time, and that there's depreciation costs in all types of infrastructure that we put out there. So if we kind of abstract those things more over time and we think about those counterfactuals and we think about like what is the money that over the course of the next 100 years we're going to have to put in to increase or maintain or decrease access, and we kind of start to make those apples to apples comparisons, that's going to help us understand something that currently we don't have a good mental model to understand.
Appreciate that, Thomas. Okay, going to go to this to another transit and integration topic. So this first one is for you, Thomas. You're in the public transportation division, but your presentation suggested that you expanded your scope beyond public transportation. Can you explain why?
Sure. Yeah. Kind of just hinted at that with the need for apples to apples comparisons. But I guess the other thing I'll say is just that, access is a relative measure. There's no correct amount of access. There's no best amount of access. Access is something that is determined by how human communities and cultures and travel behaviors are structured. And so we looked beyond public transportation because just presenting numbers about public transportation access didn't really do anything. It didn't paint a picture of what public transportation access looked like, but positioning it between what does public transportation provide versus walking alone, and how does that compare to the access that someone expects if they're a driver, that presents numbers that mean something in a relative sense. So we found basically that we needed to expand our scope beyond public transportation in order to describe public transportation appropriately.
But when you say there's no right amount of access, then how do you know when you've provided enough?
That's a good question. It's something that we need more research on, and something that many good researchers have started to think about. What are the thresholds of access that really matter from a public health perspective? How close do you need those grocery stores to be in order to have an appropriate daily experience of food access? I think we can do more work in order to determine those thresholds, but there's also always just going to be aspects of just like expectation and culture that are involved in that, and that's not a bad thing. The point of transportation is to get together to do things that we want to do as humans. It's not just so that we can be robots marching around and getting to our jobs and going home. That's why we included leisure and recreational facilities as one of our metrics, because we didn't want to reinforce a narrative that people are only allowed to take the bus to work. People are allowed to take the bus to a museum, to a park, to a restaurant, to a bar. They're allowed to go wherever they want. It's about want, not need sometimes.
Okay, so a question for the panel. How are different modes of transportation being integrated into these statewide network performance discussions? And are we seeing progress toward treating transit and active transportation on equal footing with highway access?
Yeah, I guess just to start thinking about our dashboards, they all incorporate a component of transit and think about the quality of infrastructure. For example, that's with that Community Transportation Explorer, looking at the infrastructure score, looking at pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure. And then, I think then our service coverage planning tool that really focuses on transit. And especially, I know Massachusetts, like most of the transit service or the really like frequent transit services in kind of the core Boston area. So focusing on throughout the state, making sure that there's coverage to important destinations via transit throughout the whole state.
Thanks. Anyone else want to take that one on?
I think we show a lot in one of our metrics. We have this ratio basically of like modal access on all the non-auto modes to auto access, and that has informed a lot of discussions. Even just the map, the visualization of like transit access to auto access in California. You can go to the place like downtown San Francisco where it's, kind of hard to drive and there's a lot of job concentration and transit concentration. It's basically the peak in California of transit access. And it's you can get to like, depending on how you measure it, like 20 to 30% of the jobs that you could get to driving. In most places, it's like 1 to 2%. So those numbers tend to tell a lot. And then when we actually run the metrics, for example, I talked about the like percent change in access measure. Auto projects and highway projects typically don't score that well, just as a function of the network is already so robust compared to the other networks that there's not a lot of room for improvement. Like you're seeing like small decreases in travel time in like certain places, where with the transit networks in California, there's a lot of missing links still. And so those projects comparatively, can do really good.
Thanks. Okay, here's one of my favorite questions here. How will we know when and if people are better off from all of our efforts to improve destination access? And what will prove that we are truly moving the needle on access to destinations and improving people's lives?
So, that's a pretty deep question. My answer is similar to what I typed earlier in the chat, which is I think access connects really well to the amount of power agencies have to shape options. And then what people do with those different options and choices is less under the control of agencies putting infrastructure out there. So to me, maximizing access in terms of that choice framework, in terms of that low cost framework, that in and of itself is maybe the end goal, because certainly people are going to use these systems in different ways. But where the agency has like direct responsibility is like making things possible.
Who will address then the constraints that might be present in some people's lives that would prevent them from being able to use all those options? Maybe not the transportation agency, maybe so, but anyway, okay, I like your answer, Eric. I have an addition to it, is that I think we'll find that some folks are not able to take advantage of those, and I would like to of the options provided to them, and I'd like to get to the bottom of that in some areas where we would see what I might call a mismatch between folks who have great access, but they might not be able to use it, or they have a constraint that's preventing that. Okay, so Lori does need 30 seconds for wrap up, so I think that might be our last statement on it. Didn't mean to totally have the last word. I'll give it to Lori. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. And virtual claps. So thank you to our presenters for sharing their expertise, and to all of our attendees for your engagement around this very important topic. I do encourage you to continue engaging with us, to learn more about the Committee on Performance-Based Management, to access the series archives, and to explore performance management resources. Make sure to visit the TPM portal at tpm-portal.com. Our next webinar will be on August 19th. Followed by another TPM webinar on October 21st. We do hope that you will join us for those. We do look forward to seeing you there at an upcoming subcommittee meeting and in San Diego at the annual CPBM meeting. I want to thank everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.